I'm John Batchelor. This is CBS Eye on the World. I go to 1783, bound for Baltimore from Europe. On board, a young man who's a butcher's assistant. His name is Johann Jakob Astor. He is bound for his relatives and his friends in New York City via Baltimore. However, he is also the first millionaire, multimillionaire in the North American continent. And how he makes his money is the subject of a brand new book that I recommend to everyone. It's a joy. Beaverland, How One Weird Rodent Made America. Leila Philip is the author. The professor is a professor of English Department and Environmental Studies program at the College of the Holy Cross. We go now to Johann Jakob Astor, overhearing a conversation on deck. Professor, a very good evening to you. Thank you very much. Congratulations. What did the young Astor hear and what did he do with it? Good evening.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is just such a pleasure. Well, I just thought this was such a fantastic story. So he's headed for the New World with 7 flutes because his plan after saving up money is to start a music business in Manhattan. But he overhears these traders talking about something, and they're talking about these staggeringly high prices they can make for a trade item because the markup is something like, even after they subtract transportation costs, it's almost 900% profit they can make by transporting this item that they can get easily in North America. If they ship it back to London and sell it easily, they can make that kind of profit. And he figures out that they're talking about beaver fur. So as soon as he gets to Manhattan, quick as he can, he sells those flutes and starts figuring out how to buy beaver fur. And that is the start of Johann Jakob Astor's fortune. And he becomes America's first millionaire, multimillionaire. And he goes on to found one of our first corporations. And it's an extraordinary story of the beginning of, this, I guess, the larger story of how beavers played a role in shaping our country. The first foundations of wealth came from beaver fur. So it wasn't just our first economies, as I go on into in the book. It really was that beavers would literally shape the continent. But stepping back to your question and the conversation about Astor, beaver would become so important to the establishment of capitalism here, jump-starting capitalism, that it would soon be on the first seal of New York City. It's going to be before long on the first seal of major universities like MIT. It's going to be on pretty much every road and landing in every state in the country by the time the story's over. So
Astor has a lot of good ideas. One is that he marries the daughter of his landlord, I believe, Sarah Todd, and she's very keen on his development. And this is 1783, but in 1803, Thomas Jefferson, the president, enlists the 2 men we know as Lewis and Clark to explore the new Louisiana Purchase. And this gives Astor a better idea. What is it, Professor?
well, this is really interesting. So I should say, very quickly, by the age of 27, Astor's net worth was something like $40,000. I think that translates to $850,000 today. And he was just getting started. By that point, he was trading furs up and down the Hudson River, going west toward the Great Lakes, and then up to Montreal. He was highly established as one of the most important fur traders because he was getting access to the very valuable Canadian furs. So when he gets wind of the expedition, he realizes that when they come back, they have established basically what could become trading routes from east to west. And his plan is that he will finance an expedition along all the trading routes that Lewis and Clark took. Jefferson very much wants to go back along the routes that Lewis and Clark took to spread democracy and settle the West and go beyond the Mississippi River and go hit that Pacific coast and see what's out there. But he doesn't have money. The government is poor at this point. So what Astor does is he really dupes Jefferson. He puts together what is a paper company, and he presents it as this mission that he will help fund the expedition. And in the end, he basically sets up trading posts in all the places that the Lewis and Clark expedition went. And of course, they are controlled by Astor as Astor-controlled trading centers. And then he gets to Oregon and he settles a trading post on the Pacific coast, and he names it Astoria. And that is a key linchpin.
He sends out two expeditions, one overland and one by sea. I wrote down the name of the ship, the Tonquin.
Yes.
Apparently, the Tonquin is apparently captained by Bligh himself. This is Mutiny on the Bounty in 1811 or something. He abuses his crew, and in order to escape him through the Columbia River mouth with a bad seas, you tell a very dramatic story. They escaped by founding a fort, Astor, Oregon. You visited this part of the country. Do they remember all of this? Is this celebrated?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. So, yeah, thank you. I kind of, reduced the story to one narrative. There's an overland voyage, and then there's a sea voyage. So Astor is quite brilliant because what he's going to have a trade route overland, but what he plans is that ships are going to leave Oregon. They're going to take a trade route that goes across the ocean. They're going to trade to Europe, come back via Hawaii. They're going to trade through China. He's going to have a global trading empire, basically. So the mutiny is extraordinary because the captain is so abusive that eventually the ship gets blown up because everything just goes haywire. But they do found the fort, and they found Astoria. When I went out there, I was really interested to see how much of this history was remembered. But what I would discover is that Astoria is a beautiful little city on the coast of Oregon, and it's at the mouth of the Columbia River. It's absolutely gorgeous. But they really don't remember John Jacob Astor and the fur trade. It was just too far back. And really the cannery, the salmon fishing industry replaced beaver fur, because what would happen is John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company was set up, and it was so efficient that very quickly they trapped out the beaver. So they over extracted the resource and the beaver were gone. So he set up this magnificent trade route, and then the resource was emptied out. He didn't care because he had the trade route and he had enough money to move into real estate. But so I think the fur trade was done by then, and Astoria moved into fishing and canneries started.
What I took from your book, Professor, is that the beaver becomes the foundation for the wealth creation of New York City. Astor is the first of multimillionaires, not the last. And the property purchasing and selling that tells the story of capitalism in the early 19th century. And at the bottom of all of this is the beaver. And the beaver is wiped out. That's the part of the story I've always missed until your book. Pay attention to the beaver. Wiping out the beaver was the crisis. They didn't see it, but you tell that story.
Well, I think it's really interesting that we've forgotten the beaver. And, the conversion of natural resources into power, it's always been the propelling force of empire. Asia had spices and silk, and the Atlantic had cod, and North America just happened to be full of beaver. Something like 400 million beaver once filled this continent. But it's true, in the colonial period, beaver pelts were a unit of trade. it revved up the engines of capitalism in the 1900s later. And when the Hudson's Bay Company started here, and the AFC that John Jacob Astor established later, were established, the beaver-made dollar was literally a unit of trade. There were tokens that were based on the number of beaver pelts. So a gun, I think a gun was something like 8 to 14 pelts. You could get 5 pounds of lead for 1 pelt. Literally, the beaver dollar was not an expression, it was a thing. It was a currency. But
Let's
it is.
let's come to the
Sorry.
21st century, Professor, because you begin this story with a wonderful visit at a beaver in your hometown of Woodstock, Connecticut. So we leave behind the 18th and 19th century exploitation of this brilliant creature, Castor canadensis, and we come to the 21st century and what is to be done. This is the book Beaverland. Leila Philip is the author. How one beard rodent made America. And we come to Woodstock, Connecticut, where the professor lives, and she begins her tale of beaver exploration and explanation by bonding with a beaver in a local pond down Pulpit Rock Road, which is not paved, according to this report. I don't think it has been, but this is a part of Connecticut that enjoys beavers. And Professor, it's charming the way you observe the beaver. They're nocturnal creatures. So you had to go at near sunset. Is that how you observe?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm actually glad not to be talking about colonial period when beavers were a currency anymore. It was so kind of heartbreaking to go back into that historical moment and think about that. But yes, beavers are actually crepuscular, I would discover. So they come out in the evening and they work nocturnally at night. So I was walking one evening and I witnessed a beaver making a pond near my house. And it was one of the most incredible things I'd ever seen. It just literally stopped me in my tracks. And I just couldn't stop watching this beaver. And then this beaver was watching me, and we got into this relationship where it was part of my day to go down to the beaver pond and watch this beaver. What I would learn when I researched this book, and it would lead me into a 6-year journey, as it would turn out, researching this book and the whole story and set of stories in the book. But what I would discover is that it's actually adult females that tend to go out and inspect the dam every evening. And so I quickly assumed that the beaver I was watching was a female, and it turns out that was true, probably. And then my beaver disappeared, and that set me on a journey to figure out why. I was so incredibly bereft because what I had witnessed was so magical. It happened so fast. This kind of swampy area that I paid no never mind to swelled into a glorious woodland pond. It just seemed like within days. It actually probably was more like weeks, but then water filled the area, and within a relatively short period of time, an extraordinary amount of wildlife came to the area. And what I was actually witnessing, what I would discover and what I would learn, and I write about in the book, is what I was witnessing was the tremendous biodiversity that beavers bring to a wetland when they create it. So researchers now know that a beaver altered wetland like this brings something like 15 times more plankton and microbial life to the water. And then it just goes up from there. 30% more animal species that you can see, dramatically more birds, etc. So, we're used to thinking about things like coral reefs as valuable, really valuable sanctuaries of biodiversity, but we're not used to valuing swamps and wetlands. And these are our coral reefs. These are the coral reefs of North America. And it's one of the things I really leaned into heavily in the book and researched, because I think it's so important for us to start valuing them now. But that was the start of the book. So thank you for asking.
Well, now you send us immediately to Kitsi-Amisqua, the story of the great beaver.
Yes.
This is the Algonquin people. There are other theories and reputations and stories told of the great beaver, but the Kitsi-Amisqua was a beaver who was asked by Obamakwa, the great god person, to stop damming up a river because you were flooding out the native peoples. They were begging God, please stop the beaver. The beaver defied God and kept building.
Yeah.
Kitsi-Amisqua. This is the Algonquin legend, correct, Professor? This is
yes. Well, it's one of them, and it was, I did a lot of research into indigenous ecological knowledge and thinking about the beaver, because as I researched the book, and it was really interesting to discover that contemporary science and really cutting edge thinking about ecology is actually taking us back to a lot of indigenous environmental knowledge and awareness of the role and value of the beaver. Because beavers, we talked about how they jump-started capitalism here and our first economies, but they literally shaped the continent. So our watersheds, our geology were influenced by beavers over the millennia. So literally North America was and is Beaverland. And if we learn how to look for it, we can see it. And so the story of the great beaver, thank you for mentioning that, is really a wonderfully subversive tale, because first of all, it acknowledges how important the beaver is in the world. So, but it also is, I think, an environmental parable, because there are many Algonquian stories about the dangers of excess resource extraction or hoarding resources or being greedy. And the beaver is actually being greedy. He's taking too much water, so he has to be punished. And his punishment is to be chased by Obamakwa up and down the Atlantic seaboard and chased and beaten with a club. And everywhere he's beaten, cliffs form and waterfalls form. So it's also a deep time story about the land that is fun. But at the end,
we have 30 seconds, Professor. Go ahead.
It's a teaching story about how you have to really respect your obligations to others.
Leila Philip is the author of Beaverland. We've just touched on the beaver as a source of capitalism. The beaver is the source of richness, but at the same time, the beaver won't stop building. The only creature in the solar system other than Homo sapiens who transforms the environment radically, I learned from the professor. So the book is Beaverland. Leila Philip is the author at the College of Holy Cross. We're going back to the 19th century and the discovery of the beaver in the wilderness by early anthropology, Castor canadensis. Now, once upon a time, the beavers were as big as bears, but that's several million years ago, leading up until the end of the Ice Age. We're talking about the beaver that is recognizable in colonial America. And now we're in the late 19th century. A man named Lewis Henry Morgan in 1855 and then again in 1862 has converted his obsession from the trout to the beaver. And he's on an expedition in the Lake Superior Basin to photograph. This is early days. This would be like, I have an iPhone, I'm going to do something with it, to photograph a beaver dam. Professor, this is a story you can't make up. Morgan is a character. What did he make of this beaver dam? What were his thoughts?
Oh, thank you. This is one of my favorite sections of the book. And he is such an amazing American figure because he's such a study in contradictions. So Lewis Henry Morgan, he's one of America's first ethnographers and anthropologists. He was also an industrialist, so he was a railroad investor. He managed to write actually what is still considered one of the most important and earliest ethnographies of the Iroquois people. And he goes out to visit his friend, one of the Eli's, who's building a railroad line to mine for iron ore near Marquette, Michigan. And as you point out, he's a big trout fisherman, and while they're fishing for trout, they can't get anywhere because they keep having to go over these magnificent, lift the boats over these magnificent beaver dams. And he falls in love with these constructions. He's just fascinated by the beaver dams, and he makes it his mission for the next 15 years to document and map them. And he produces a book called The American Beaver, publishes it in 1868. It is the first authoritative account of the beaver in North America, in the United States anyway, and it is still considered authoritative, and it's tremendously important because what he was able to do was document these beaver constructions before they were destroyed. And so it's a picture of, probably one of our only pictures of kind of Beaverland. And what it reveals is the extent to which beavers, when they work a river system, they'll build a series of dams. They'll never build just one dam, but a series of dams in a row, and their dams will be supported by canals and a whole network of interacting impoundments. And I could go on and on. You just have to sort of wind me up.
You traveled to Lake Superior Basin.
Yes,
you observed the dams which remain today. I believe you said one is being built by 15 generations. And
yes.
What was shocking to me to learn that the dams not have only survived, but the land has survived thanks to the beavers, of the extreme abuse of the iron mines of the 19th and 20th century. In other words, industrial America, steel America, plundered the Lake Superior Basin, left behind toxic pools, but the beavers kept working.
Well, this is what's, really significant. This little rodent that we have tended to think of first as a pelt, and then we tend to think of as a pest or ignore completely, has this truly valuable role cleaning water for us. Because what they do is they build wetlands that serve as huge underground sponges, as if you will. And so the water is slowed down and cleansed as it sinks into the aquifer. So they've been out there cleaning all this time.
Well, take it there. What is it like to walk in that area? What's it look like, Professor?
Oh, it's just magnificent. I mean, I was on a real quest. I had my little map in my hand, and a fellow from the Lake Superior watershed helped me, who had a lot of GIS knowledge, and we managed to find, spoiler alert, I describe in chapter 7, on the map, pond number 19 and the Great Dam Grass Lake plate number, I think it's 7. And it was like being back in time. I felt like I was looking at Beaverland at times. And in fact, at one point we were standing on one of these beaver dam impoundments, and a moose family showed up. I was with someone who had been there for over a decade trying to find and photograph a moose, lived there, was out there every day, had never seen a moose. We're just standing there, and this beautiful male moose comes out. I mean, it was like something from a nature movie, and then a female and a calf. It was incredible. And then, of course, on the way out, we meet the beaver fur trappers, and they knew exactly where to find the moose because they knew exactly where the beavers were, and wildlife follows beavers. So it was sort of a very ironic, funny moment.
You mentioned the trappers. We must attend. This is part of the book where you spend a great deal of time on the road, going to fur harvesting gatherings where pelts are sold, not only beavers, but raccoons and foxes and muskrats, everything. this is the part of the book that was a total revelation to me. There's a subculture, or just there's a culture in America that continues to trap. But you tell one lovely anecdote of a moment when you had been invited by a participant in these auctions, and you came to the door with your pen and pad in your hand, is how I picture it. Clearly a college professor whom she admits I drive a Subaru. Okay. And the door opens and there's a man to greet you. And he takes up a walkie-talkie or maybe his iPhone and screams, "Auntie, auntie, auntie." And
Yeah.
three big men show up. What was auntie? What was that all about, Professor?
Yeah, well, thank you for mentioning that, because documenting this world wasn't easy, and it was intimidating. It was a world that this was 2016, a very divisive moment in our culture, and you could argue still is. Whether you were part of urban culture or rural culture, you were kind of identified very quickly all over this country, but particularly, for this group who feel that they're misunderstood, and there's anti means anti-trapper, or maybe animal rights activist. And so I was immediately, people would assume I was an animal rights activist. And so, but that moment resolved just fine, because I was befriended by Harlan Lean, a really wonderful character who I describe in the book, who's a fur trader, who kind of took me under his wing, taught me a great deal. And once they knew that Harlan had given me the okay, I pretty much had free pass to go wherever I wanted. And many people spoke to me who I think would not have. But I think, whenever you're going into a world where people aren't sure if you're friend or foe, you have to just listen and let people realize that you are there to learn and not to judge.
You also befriended a Connecticut trapper, a volunteer trapper, Herb Sabansky Jr., who's no longer with us, but you spent time in Connecticut walking dams and lodges with Herb, and he showed you what trapping means to himself, and we can, by analogy, say to his colleagues that you met. And it's their connection to early America, to Europe as well. We've already evidenced that trappers were part of the capitalism of North America. Did Herb think about it that way?
Yeah, he really felt he was keeping alive an American legacy and a family legacy. But I also think on a deeper level, for him, it was a way to have a significant life. And I found that really fascinating, just the search to do something meaningful with your life, to have a connection with the natural world and community, on such different terms than I was used to. I found that really eye-opening and interesting. And I actually have to say that I learned a great deal about the natural world and about beavers from the fur trappers I went out with. And in fact, right now, I'm involved in documenting a growing beaver wetland as part of, I think it's going to contribute to a scientific study. And some of the things I'm able to contribute because of what I learned from Herb and other fur trappers. And, they had a knowledge base sometimes that the scientists didn't, from a lab perspective. So I really think the knowledge that they were able to contribute was and is valuable. It doesn't mean I'm a fur trapper. I'm not actually interested in trapping beaver for fur.
You've mentioned the way they talk about it, trapped out. Fur trappers are often called in Connecticut because the wetlands spread and damage property around. Living side by side with beavers means that you have to deal with the fact that beavers are very busy creating estuaries and waterways. That's what they do. And mankind is insisted upon living in the Beaverland, not beavers living with us. We're living with beavers.
Yeah.
And so what I learned is that 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 friction between human settlement and beaver industry is an ongoing tension. And we'll come to that again, but did Herb settle it? Because he was doing volunteer trapping. Did he settle it in his own mind that he was a necessary tool of the state?
I think in his own mind, he felt he was helping people. But I think he also, he would say at the same time that he loved beavers. And I think he did. So I think you can have both things at the same time. For example, he would never trap a beavers in summer, even if the landowner wanted it, because the kits were young. He just wouldn't do it.
Kid is a baby beaver.
Yeah.
And apparently they're so cute, you can't stand to see them on TikTok.
It's just, they're unbelievably cute.
Right,
I think they're going viral now.
little hands and a big tail, and they don't see well. The beavers have poor eyesight, but they have skills everywhere else. Plus, they're chiefly an underwater creature. When they come on land with us, they're doing us a favor. They much prefer to meet us down in their world, underwater. And they really do cut down trees very quickly. The professor has guided me to what to look for beaver signs when I'm walking through the woods, and what to look for in beaver lodges when I'm observing in a wetland near my home in Connecticut. So the professor teaches, but we need now to go, we're going to leave Lewis Henry Morgan in the late 19th century, and we need to go to Depression America in Little Falls, New York, and an amazing array of beavers living not only side by side with human settlement, but with humans, especially one, Dorothy Richards. The book is Beaverland. Leila Philip is the author, How One Weird Rodent Made America. Little Falls was once, I learned these things from the professor, it was once the cheese capital of America. Did Wisconsin know this? Apparently it's at the end of the Mohawk River Valley, but it attracted a young family, and Dorothy Richards was born there in the early part of the 20th century. And she grew up to be a beaver whisperer. Please explain Beaversprite, Professor.
Oh, it's such a marvelous story. Thank you. And I could write a whole book about Dorothy Richards. So, she's born at the end of the 1900s, and she grows up in Little Falls. And
the end of the 19th century. She grows up in the 20th century, right?
Yeah. She grows up in the 20th century. So by 1902, at the tail end of the Gilded Age, she's jumping rope on the streets of Little Falls, and she's a sickly child. So her parents decide that she's not going to go to college, but she's very, very smart. She reads a lot. She ends up marrying. She gets a job in the local library. She ends up marrying the librarian's brother and has a life in Little Falls. And life takes its turn the way it does, and they buy a little farmhouse. The Depression happens, so they have to come home and buy a little farmhouse outside of Little Falls. They start a stationery business because that's the only way they can make ends meet. And there are two streams on this property, and her husband's friend works for the Forest Service, and they offer them some beavers because they're looking for a place to have some beavers. It's all just chance. And these beavers come live on the property, and then the rest is history. She just falls in love with watching these beavers. And next thing you know, she has founded the first beaver sanctuary in the country, has dedicated her life to studying beavers, has convinced the state by 1938 to let her raise 2 beavers in her house. And within, I don't know, maybe a decade, she has 14 beavers living in a tiny farmhouse with her, and the rest is history. She published a book about it in 1980, I think 6, memoir, which is really interesting, that details her life with beavers. And what's interesting about Dorothy Richards is that she recorded a lot of information about beavers that tended to be ignored at the time because she was not a trained scientist. But now scientists are documenting that what she recorded is actually true, which I find interesting, because she was working on intuition. And
Let's tell a whopper, Professor. Okay.
okay,
You're at a auction, a fur auction. And
right.
you meet a grown-up man who says to you that he knew Dorothy Richards when he was a child. He visited her house at Beaversprite. Middle Sprite and Little Sprite are the two streams. Beaversprite is the sanctuary. It's a house. The beavers
Right.
in the house with Dorothy and her husband. He tells a story about being a child there, and his father was sitting in a chair. Please, what happened next?
Okay, thank you for looping back to that. So I'm literally leaving the wild fur auction at Herkimer after hours and hours of watching wild furs being sold, including beavers. And on the way out, this fur trapper, we start chatting, and he invites me to an event in Little Falls. And when I hear the word Little Falls, my ears perk up, and I just say, "Have you ever heard of this place called Beaversprite?" And then he says, "Oh, well, when I was a kid, I remember going with my dad, and his dad was a plumber, and he was actually called in because there was a leak in the basement. The beavers had actually untwisted the water pipes. They had figured out how to untwist the water pipes, and they had opened the water in the basement. They'd flooded the basement, which is really truly funny, those little hands. And so they were sitting in the parlor waiting for Dorothy Richards to come back, and a beaver just trundled by and started pushing his father's chair. I guess the fur trapper was about 8 then. And he said he remembers that because they're just sitting there, the beaver's pushing at the chair, and Dorothy Richards comes back in and says, "You're in the beaver's way." So his father moved his chair away, and the beaver just walked on by. I guess his father was sitting in the beaver's pathway. Beavers are kind of OCD. They have to just go their path.
Also, Professor, is that an indication how beavers only do shortest distance? Is that what we're seeing?
Yes, that the beaver was in the process of, going to it was a young beaver, and it was actually practicing building a dam. So it was taking kindling from the fireplace and stacking it against a potential pinch point. And Dorothy was letting it do that. She was observing that. It was in a door frame. And so it had calculated that's the shortest distance. That's the pinch point, as if this was a river. So it would make no sense to the beaver to take a right or a left. That would be putting it at risk unnecessarily. Anyway, it made sense from the beaver's point of view.
Now, you visited Beaversprite, which is now a sanctuary, but the house is still there.
Yeah, it's quite wonderful. So Sharon and Owen Brown, two scientists, actually were visiting Dorothy Richards and helping her out in the last years of her life, and sort of became
less than a minute, Professor. Go ahead.
Oh, her mentors. And they've actually continued her work and bought property nearby and founded a second sanctuary. So Beaversprite has continued, and they have a new sanctuary nearby in the lower Adirondacks.
And of course, Dorothy's favorite beaver, who lived to the ripe old age of 19, was named Eager. And there's a photograph in the professor's book of Eager sitting at the table with Dorothy, discussing the day's events. The book is Beaverland, How One Weird Rodent Made America. Leila Philip is the author. And here in the 21st century now, I learned from the professor that the beaver is a fascination to science. People studying our natural world and asking, can we learn from this? What have we done wrong? How can we restore balance given the 8 to 9 billion people on the planet? Now dealing with the onerous climate change story. At the same time, we want to live better lives. So we go to the beaver, Castor canadensis, and we ask, is a beaver intelligent? Professor, it's meant to be a provocative question. Immediately, everybody's going to think, what's intelligence? But in the scheme of things, how have beavers been regarded, and what are we learning about their ability to construct radical environmental solutions and at the same time learn? Good evening again.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd have to say that beavers have fueled the human imagination on every continent that they've been found. So this question of beavers and how smart are they or aren't they has gone way back to Aesop. So one of Aesop's fables is that the beavers are so canny that they can remove their testicles and throw them at hunters to divert them. So there have been all kinds of theories about beaver cleverness that are not related to anything to do with factual, even anatomy. Beavers actually have internal glands. They don't even have external glands. But, to think about this today, what we're understanding now is that we really don't have up-to-date science on the animal itself. Most of what we know about beavers has been based on studies of what beavers can do, which is build. So they're brilliant at building things. And we've studied their dams and their lodges and their beaver damming complexes, and we have quite a bit of information about that. But as to beaver intelligence, we've had a lot of, fun thinking about it at times. I mean, there were some papers that came out of Switzerland and Europe and Russia in the 60s from the Brain Institute, but they didn't get very far. I think I really leaned hard into this question because I really wanted to find out, what do we know about the beaver brain? And it turns out, as I say, we really don't know very much, because if we just look at the traditional barometers of how you measure intelligence, the beaver doesn't rank very high. It's got the intelligence, something in the rodentia line, better than a squirrel, less than the Norway rat. But part of studying beaver intelligence is logistical, because they live mostly underwater, they're clumsy on land, they can barely see. And, good luck trying to get them to go in a maze or pull a lever. Those kinds of traditional lab experiments just don't work with a beaver. But I write about this scientist that I found out about her work at Harvard, Jordan Kennedy, and I think she has begun to really crack the code in interesting ways by thinking about beaver intelligence, not so much in terms of the individual, but in terms of a collective intelligence.
Right. Jordan Kennedy has studied termites who think collectively, and she now studies beavers thinking collectively, but she has an additional detail that is revelatory. She's part of the Blackfeet tribe, and she combines her thinking as a researcher in the 21st century with the legend of her peoples and the beaver bundle. What is that, Professor?
Yeah, well, just to go back up a step, I mean, she's also at Harvard. When I interviewed her, she was a member of the Soft Math Lab, and that's a lab at Harvard which combines mathematics, physics, engineering, evolutionary biology, and they study phenomena in the natural world. So biomimicry, basically looking at design applications from the natural world, but also in particular, many of the people in that lab are looking at robotics. And so it's really interesting to think about the research that she was doing on beavers and thinking about them in relation to, say, termites and ants and bees who build by following simple rules. So that's a kind of behavior that's called stigmergy. And people have studied those kind of rules and developed algorithms that have been used for robotics. So I think it's really fascinating to think that there might be in the future kind of beaver bots. I mean, imagine if we could have underwater bots the size of beavers that could help us in high flood situations. But anyway, leaving that aside, the other thing that I think is pretty amazing about Jordan Kennedy as an individual, and we talked a lot about it in the book, was she grew up on the Blackfeet Reservation and really grew up in the culture of the Blackfeet. And the Blackfeet historically have been, as indigenous peoples of the arid northern plains, they understood the value of the beaver in bringing water. And in fact, the Blackfeet had strict prohibitions against hunting beavers. So while the Algonquin peoples of the woodland, forests out here in the east allowed for the hunting of beavers, in arid northern plains areas, peoples like the Blackfeet prohibited the hunting of beavers altogether. And I think they understood that the beavers played a much more valuable role managing the water cycle, bringing water to the land, slowing it down, cleansing it. So all the reasons why beavers are valued today as aids in helping us with problems we're facing with climate change, drought and wildfire and flooding, the indigenous peoples understood millennia ago and throughout, and still understand today, because there are programs in the Blackfeet Reservation right now to restore beavers to river systems. So it's really interesting.
The beaver is a built-in system of metrics. And one of the ones that I learned from the professor's conversation with Jordan Kennedy is that the beaver tail, not to be slighted, it looks odd. As the professor says, it looks like a car ran over it. It's quite flattened, but I'm told that it has cells in it that can measure the flow of water. Why is that important? Because a beaver will not attempt to dam something that's more than 250 liters per second. Do you know what 250 liters per second is? I certainly don't, but a beaver does. That explains the genius here. It doesn't try to hold back a flood. It develops a way of building up a pool, a beaver pool with a dam. And I take it, Professor, because you observed many more beaver dams in your research than I will in my whole life, that a beaver dam isn't absolutely blocking water all the time. There is water flowing through it. They're patching it all the time, but they make sure that the water that flows through it isn't excessive. Is that correct? I mean, they're managing the water constantly. It's not just build it and forget it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've said that really well. And I'm watching beavers right here. I hope we have a little chance to talk about that. So normally beavers would not be creating a wetland in the winter, but because we had this strangely warm January and February out here, until recently anyway, the beavers took advantage of that warm weather, and their dam was breached. They had a near fatal situation in their pond. They had to flee. What might have been fatal became an opportunity because of the warm weather. And I've been watching them build a new dam. And what's been really interesting is to watch where they built it, this perfect sort of pinch point where, exactly as you say, the water is the right flow rate. But then also to watch how for a period of time they stopped the water altogether. And then just a couple weeks ago, they actually allowed a little current of water to go through. And I was there with a researcher yesterday, and we actually measured the height of the dam, and we figured out how much water is being impounded now behind it, quite a bit. And he figured there's now enough water pressure behind the dam that the beavers have kind of figured that they need to let some of that pressure out. So how are they making these decisions? How do they know to make these decisions at the right time? We don't know yet, but we can observe that they are making them. And they're going to do that before the dam breaches or breaks. So I love that, we have all this sophisticated science equipment, and we can measure exactly the flow rate. And the beaver, can apparently figure that out, we think, from the sensitivity of the blood vessels in the tail. But this is another example of what we thought we knew about the beaver. We've had to reevaluate, because previous to Jordan Kennedy's study, it was widely thought that beavers responded to the sound of water, and that's why they would build. And her point is, if that were only true, if that were the only environmental cue, they would be trying to block up Niagara Falls, which they don't try to do. They know, like in your local river, that it's too strong. They won't try to dam the Connecticut River or a swift river. they might swim in it and use it for transportation, but they won't try to block it up. They know they can't stop that kind of a flow rate. So again and again, we're discovering that we need more information about the mammal itself.
The mammal itself and what it can do for our river systems. We're going to go to the Yale Myers Forest in Connecticut with the professor next. And then we're going to go to the White Birch Mountains because the beaver is teaching all the time. The book is Beaverland, How One Weird Rodent Made America. Leila Philip is the author. The professor introduces us to Dr. Denise Burchsted, and we go to the Yale Myers Forest. And the professor invariably has an episode where she has to find a walking stick because she winds up in these wetlands about to tumble into the water. But here we are, we have a walking stick. What are you learning from Dr. Burchsted, Professor?
Well, I think the first thing that I learned from Dr. Burchsted, who is a wonderful researcher and lecturer, is that a river is not just the Hudson River or the Housatonic or the Connecticut River. It's really this intricate system of brooks and streams and creeks. It's every little trickle of water that's going through the land that's interconnected. We need to think of the river system as almost like a fan of arteries and veins that spreads out through the land. And once you think about the river system that way, no longer just as one single current, but this multi-threaded, braided, maybe messy, interacting network of veins and lines of water, then I think you can start to understand why beavers are so important, because they will move throughout this system, swelling it into wetlands, so that pretty soon all along that network you have beaver ponds that are like beads along a chain. And then the water is allowed to slow down and sink down. And that begins to really solve our current problems of water moving just too quickly through the watershed, so that it rips through and rips out the topsoil. It doesn't get cleansed. And it also means that our land is dried out. So like last summer here in Connecticut, we had a lot of rain and then we had a drought because the rain just washed through the river system and we didn't get the benefit of it.
The river is a way of thinking about a river system managed by the beaver. And if I understand this correctly, Professor, because I'm taking notes, I should regard the flowing water as 1/3. I should regard the swampy land, the wetland, as another third, and I should regard the meadow, this was the revelation to me, as another third. Is that how to think of it? 3 parts?
Yes. Yeah. So that they're all interacting. And this is what, in broad terms, someone like Dr. Burchsted, who's a highly trained ecologist and wildlife specialist and geomorphologist, someone who studies both geology and the shape of rivers and the hydrology of rivers, is what a paleo river would look like. And a paleo river is one of the rivers that spread through North America before colonization. So I grew up looking at rivers and creeks and streams that I thought were natural, but were really the vestiges of, hundreds of years of sawmills and other vestiges of colonization and then industrialization. And we're only now realizing that we don't understand how to help our river system because we don't really have many examples of the river system before it was transformed. By the 1700s, there were just hundreds and hundreds of sawmills throughout New England, for example. I mean, thousands, really. Every little creek had a sawmill on it. So the profound extent to which we've transformed the river system can't be underestimated. But at the same time, what I would learn from Dr. Burchsted is the incredible rate at which beavers, if we let them get into a river system, the rate at which they can work on those creeks and streams and that river system and shift it back into better functionality is also evident. So later in the book, when we go up into the White Mountains, she becomes really excited, like other scientists, because we're actually looking at the zigzag and other brooks where beavers have been working for 70 years undisturbed. And so the river system is starting to look like something closer to what it would have looked like before colonization.
We're going to the White Mountains, but before we go there, the book is filled with anecdotes, and I want to summarize them by saying the Algonquin people, again, I think that's what we're talking about, referred to the beaver as underwater people. Do I say that correctly?
Yeah. Isn't that marvelous? And we should say peoples, because there were so many different regional peoples under the umbrella of the Algonquin, so many different indigenous peoples on this continent. We're just learning, I think, now how much more history we have to learn.
And the beaver was their friend, a source of warmth, a source of food, castor comes from the beaver, a medicine source, and as well referred to as living side by side with the underwater people. So we're headed to the White Mountains with Professor Leila Philip. Beaverland is the book. The science of beavers is the science of geomorphology, effluvial geomorphology. I don't say it fast. That is watching how rivers shape the land, watching how land reacts to the river system. And we've learned from Professor Philip, and she's learned from other researchers, that a river is a complexity of the flowing water, which can be in drought or can be in flood, the wetlands, what looks like a swamp or a marsh, and the meadow that is emerging from the swamp and the marsh. The beaver manages all of that. And we go now to the White Mountains because Professor Burchsted did her work there 10 years before. And this is a 7,800 acre experimental forest that Leila Philip traveled to. The part that got my attention was sawgrass is a way of keeping people out in order for the animals to prosper. I thought, we don't need to go back 100 years for Indian legends. We can make them up on our own. So what does the forest look like, Professor?
Well, what was interesting to me, and it was such a privilege to go up there with Dr. Burchsted and Dr. Bailey. I mean, these are really such committed researchers, and they've done significant work. And also, I should mention about the Hubbard Brook watershed. This is where acid rain was discovered. This is a really important, it's a long-term ecological research center. It's a tremendously important place. And so it was at this place doing watershed studies that scientists discovered that acid rain existed. And it's where they discovered the detrimental impacts of acid rain. So it would have a, historically incredibly important role in the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts and the health of our environments going forward. But so I was kind of expecting to see, acid rain devastated trees the way I had seen in books. And what was marvelous was to see how lush the forest was. I felt like I was walking through a rainforest at times. It was incredibly lush. In fact, what was interesting to me to go out with researchers like this is they don't need a path. They just follow their GIS points. So we were just completely bushwhacking, which is hard work. So I described that in the book. Going out with Dr. Burchsted, you have to be ready to really seriously hike. And I'm a hiker. I thought I was pretty sturdy, so I had fun describing that. But to loop back to Yale, I do want to mention something that we didn't mention, that I forgot to mention, which is that it was in the Yale forest in 1914, right near there in the Hampton Brook, that beaver were first reintroduced to Connecticut. So it's just kind of wonderful that it was all coming together, that was studying beavers in a watershed where they had been reintroduced to the state. as part of the wildlife reintroduction program. So
Yes,
anyway, back to the White Mountains.
By the end of the 18th century in New Hampshire, beavers were rare. That's how they were culled. And about culling, we've talked a little about the fur trappers. The estimate that I have here is that culling is necessary for 35% of the beavers per year. I've written that down. That's your research. And that is because their mission is to keep beavers from interfering with humans, with flooding roads. Is there an explanation for why such a large culling?
Well, I think those figures really need to be revisited with a lot of circumspect now, because there's so many different variables, one of them being climate change, which is just as hard on the animals and wildlife as it is on us. For example, this recent warm patch, the beavers were disrupted from their lodge in December because their dam was breached. That would normally be lethal for them. So those climate change is changing all those numbers, one thing. The other thing is that development has continued, and I think those numbers made sense at a certain period of time and no longer do. There are also other things happening with the warming temperatures. For example, ticks and other parasites are now an issue during the winter because it's warmer. Not so much on beavers, but other animals. So it all has to be reevaluated. But I think the main thing that I'd like to emphasize, and I think people are reevaluating. In fact, there's I just noticed that there was a letter sent to Biden in the last week out in Oregon asking him to revisit trapping on federal lands, because there's a widespread recognition that in many cases, a living beaver can add more value for their environmental contribution than a trapped beaver as a pelt, and that really needs to be reevaluated at this moment in time. And there are many non-lethal methods of managing beaver now that have been developed. So it's really case by case. I think every town, every region has to look. If your road is being flooded, do you need to trap the beaver out, or could you put in a flow device or a pond leveler and solve the problem that way? And is the benefit of having the biodiversity that the beavers bring to that pond more valuable than taking them out? Those are questions that need to be asked case by case. I think we didn't know to ask those questions 10 years ago.
Let's take a trip with you to the Chesapeake Bay, the Chesapeake Basin. And what you learn is that the beaver is appreciated there as well, although it's a much more populated, much densely populated than New England, where we've been talking about, New Hampshire and Connecticut. And a myth says that beavers are not good for trout. What are the facts, Professor?
Oh, well, this is really kind of exciting development in science. So for a long time, a rationale for taking out beavers and beaver dams, and it's actually still in effect in many places, is that beavers warm the water, and because trout and salmonids are cold water fish, it diminishes fish populations. But in fact, science has proved again and again, particularly out in the Northwest, but also in the Midwest, that salmon populations actually increase with beaver damming complexes. So the salmon populations go up when there are beaver dams for a number of reasons. Same with trout. So yes, salmon and trout do need areas where there's clear, fast running water, but that doesn't mean that you have to remove the beavers completely.
The chain of reforestation and re-beaverization, if there is such a word, also include a favorite bird of mine, the great blue heron. Great blue herons depend upon the trout. So if you put beaver in and take care of them, the beavers build a dam. The dam has the pond that comes up has warm parts, but it has cool parts for the trout. And the great blue heron shows up. along with all the other wildlife. So beavers are the mothership of our woodlands and our meadows. They're creating all the conditions for all the other animals. Without beavers, we've got an environment that is distorted. We've wrecked the natural order of things, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, wildlife managers and scientists have called them a keystone species for a reason. They're like that block in a medieval arch, the keystone. You take that brick away and the arch falls. They are important for all the other species. So yes, it has been studied again and again that when you have beavers and a beaver wetland, you have 15 times more life in the water. You have 30% more wildlife on the shores, and it just goes up from there. So yes, more animal life all around.
There are not enough beavers for the Chesapeake Bay right now, so they've invented something called the BDA, the Beaver Dam Analogs. You witnessed one being put in. What is its mission? What does it look like, Professor?
Yeah, so the whole point of the Beaver Dam Analog is really fun. The theory is if you build it, they will come. So the idea is to create beaver habitat. It's a man-made dam, and they've really studied and perfected this. So they start shaping a degraded, channeled out creek so that it starts to pool and bend and spread over its banks and slow down. So it creates a kind of beaver habitat. And the hope is that beavers will move in there, because in states like Maryland, it's not legal to translocate or move beaver in. Out west, they will actually relocate beaver. They'll create beaver habitat and they'll relocate beaver and set them free in those places. Maybe they'll take problem beaver from one town that are in the wrong place and take them to those beaver created habitats and let them go. But the other thing that we haven't talked about is the economic value of using beavers. I mean, we need to think about beavers as millions of highly trained engineers ready to work for free. So when I was down in the Chesapeake, highly trained environmental restoration folks who build $1 million water storage ponds would say without blinking an eye, beavers could do what they were doing in some instances for free. They could build $1 million water storage pond that could hold 10 acres of water, or they could just let beavers do it and it wouldn't cost a dime. So that's real money that beavers can save townships, people, highway departments, etc.
Beavers also need our help because climate change is coming very fast. And when we come back, a catastrophe at a beaver dam. The professor is Leila Philip of the College of Holy Cross. The book is Beaverland, How One Weird Rodent Made America. 2 huge rainstorms and then a hurricane named Ida. We're now at a Edwin Way Teal's sanctuary he's a naturalist who's left us, but behind is a sanctuary for all manner of creatures, including beavers. And one day the beaver dam that is constructed, series of beaver dams, but the big one is breached and the flood waters pour into the neighborhood and the phones start ringing. And there is a solution, and we call upon Mike Callahan of Beaver Solutions. And what is the solution, Professor? What does it look like when we don't have enough beavers and we have to deal with climate change upon us?
Well, this is a really interesting example of where just the director of that local Audubon, Sarah Hemingway, was educated about beavers, and she understood their value in bringing water and biodiversity. She knew that particular spot in particular is a migratory stopover for a lot of important migratory birds. She also had been watching the water. And so when people were calling up and saying, you got to kill the beavers because this is too dangerous. I mean, it was dangerous. 9 million gallons of water came out of that breached dam, overnight. The caretaker said it sounded like a train had gone through the forest. So this can happen. And instead of trapping out the beaver and breaking the dam and taking the pond apart, she called this company Beaver Solutions, where they specialize in putting in what are called flow devices. So what they basically did, I watched them, they put a 40-foot pipe through the dam. They've figured out that if they put this pipe 40 feet out, if the inlet is 40 feet from the dam, the beavers don't stop, but try to stop it up with sticks. They put a cage around the end, so the beavers, even if no animals get in, etc., they know exactly how to do this, so it works. They have a very, very high success rate. And I went back to look at it. It's been in 2 years now. The pond has now been maintained, even with some different storm events. The pond has been maintained at a level so that even if there is another huge storm event like Ida, it can tolerate all that floodwater coming through the Hampton Brook. It's not going to break the dam. So it's an example where a little bit of proactive management means the beavers can stay and the water can stay. And I spoke to the director of the Audubon recently, and I said, how's it going? And she said she spoke to the neighbors this past summer when we had the terrible drought, and she reminded them that the reason they had water in their wells was in part because the beavers were there and Hampton Brook area didn't dry up. We had a very severe drought last July, but that part of the brook was, maintained because the beavers had so much water stored there. So, and it wasn't that expensive to do. So much more expensive than all the repair from, floods.
We come home to you, Professor, to Woodstock and your observation of the beavers working in your neighborhood. I left a moment here to see what you're observing. Now that you've published this book, you have a great deal of working knowledge of how beavers work. How are they doing?
Well, I keep an eye on them, and I was watching them this winter, and I was at first really alarmed when I saw that their dam had broken because it's winter, and normally, as I said, that would be fatal. They had to flee their lodge because the water in the pond went down. But because it was warm, they started building this new area in a low-lying, new pond in a low-lying area. And it's been just incredible to watch them. And, 7 years ago, when I first watched the beavers, it stopped me in my tracks. But now that I know everything that I know, it really gives me goosebumps because it's such an extraordinary story of resiliency and hope. I mean, what the beavers are doing, what they've done in 8+ weeks, the amount of water they've been able to impound. The local Audubon has now indicated that is probably becoming already a migratory stopover. The amount of value that they have brought is just incredible. And I was just reading an article about carbon storage. And again, we think about the Amazon rainforest as tremendously important to us because of the carbon that it stores. But we now know that wetlands store something like 10 times more carbon than the forest. So the more we learn about these wetlands, the more we need to learn how to value them and stop thinking about them as dismal swamps, and I think it's just reminding me of just what an incredible story the story of the beaver is. And it's just such a story of, I guess, hope in our time. And I think we need these stories of resiliency because they're right in our own backyards. Especially here in the East. I think anyone living in the East can walk out and probably find beavers somewhere. And
I wanted you to give a clues as to what to look for. It's freshly gnawed wood.
Yeah. Well, if you're walking
go ahead
along, sorry. Some clues. So if you're walking and you see a swampy area, look for any glints of yellow at this point that might indicate that something is freshly chewed. close down, that might be a pencil stub. They'll chew anything small, brush, but also they might take down a big tree. I mean, they've taken down 4 good-sized trees, enormous pencil points. So there could be that. Then you'll just see water starting to, if you see water starting to pool up in the woods, look around. Those will be the first signs. You won't see a beaver probably. You know, they're not going to come out during the day. Although I saw something really fun. We had a little skim of ice. I went out yesterday and there were all these holes in it. Like someone had thrown rocks all over the pond. You know what I realized it was? It was an otter that was popping up, just playing around, popping up through the ice. So to go back to your point about beavers and fish, it was on their original pond where they had fled, but an otter had clearly been just playing around, popping up through the ice, probably hunting.
The beavers are in their lodge now, and they haven't emerged yet from winter, or you think they've already emerged? You think the whole beaver clan is out there? We have 30 seconds.
Yeah. At this point, beavers will be out swimming around because there's no ice.
Okay.
So they're coming out of torpor. So they'll be moving around for sure.
I intend to go looking for beavers. You know, I have a wetland not far from where we're
Yeah.
speaking right now. And
Go in the evening.
Towards sundown.
Yeah, that's when they'll start to come out. I put up a wildlife camera. They've been coming out at 7:20 p.m. It's still dark, but pretty soon 7:20 will be light.
And I mentioned quickly, why do beavers come out at night? Because they learned as recently as Lewis and Clark that they'll get hunted during the day by these rascals, the colonials. Leila Philip, she's the author of Beaverland, How One Weird Rodent Made America. I'm John Batchelor.